Picture this. December 19th, 1944. Deep in the frozen Ardennes forest of Belgium, a column of Germany's most fearsome war machines sits motionless. Panther tanks. Tiger heavies. King Tigers that weigh 70 tons and can shred an Allied Sherman from 2 miles away. Their crews, hand-picked veterans from the 1st SS Panzer Division, stare through frost-crusted periscopes at a prize so close they can practically smell it. The morning fog clings to the valleys like a burial shroud. Ice crystals glitter on the gun barrels. Inside the tanks, exhaust fumes and body heat create a claustrophobic warmth that barely fights off the Belgian winter. The men haven't slept in 3 days. Their rations ran out yesterday, but none of that matters. 3 miles ahead, an American fuel depot. 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. Enough to reach the English Channel. Enough to split the Allied armies in half and win the war. And they cannot move. Not because the Americans have encircled them. Not because Allied bombers are screaming overhead. They are stuck because their fuel gauge is red empty. 67 tanks. 149 half-tracks. All abandoned. The crews will walk away from millions of dollars worth of German engineering and leave it for scrap because someone forgot to pack enough gas. This is not a comedy sketch. This is history. Before we dive into one of the most jaw-dropping logistical disasters of World War II, do me a favor. If you find yourself shaking your head in disbelief, and trust me, you will, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're going deep on military blunders that make you wonder how wars are ever won at all. Stick around. This one's a doozy. The perfect storm that wasn't. Let's rewind. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. The forests of Belgium and Luxembourg erupt with the sound of 1,600 German artillery pieces. Shells scream across an 80-mile front, tearing into American positions with ferocity the Allies haven't seen in months. The ground shakes. Trees explode into splinters. Foxholes collapse. Men who were sleeping moments before scramble for cover, disoriented and terrified. Operation Walk am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, has begun. The code name is deliberately deceptive. German intelligence planted rumors that this was a defensive operation designed to protect the Rhine River from Allied incursions. In reality, it's the exact opposite. A massive offensive gamble, Hitler's last roll of the dice. The architect of this gamble is Adolf Hitler himself. By late 1944, the Third Reich is on life support. The Soviets are closing in from the east, having pushed through Poland and into East Prussia. The British and Americans have liberated France and are knocking on Germany's doorstep. Antwerp, the critical Belgian port that the Allies need to funnel supplies into Europe, has just fallen into enemy hands. Without Antwerp, the Allied supply lines stretch back hundreds of miles to the beaches of Normandy. With it, they can bring the full weight of American industrial might directly to the front. Hitler's solution? A surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the same wooded, hilly terrain the Wehrmacht blitzed through in 1940 to humiliate France. The plan is audacious. Punch through thinly defended American lines, race northwest across the Meuse River, and capture Antwerp. Split the British forces in the north from the Americans in the south. Shatter Allied morale. Force a negotiated peace in the west, freeing up divisions to face the Red Army in the east. On paper, it looks brilliant. The Germans muster 3 armies. The 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, commanded by SS Obergruppenführer, OHB Sturmbannführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich. The 5th Panzer Army in the center, under General Otto von Manchefeld. The 7th Army in the south, tasked with protecting the offensive southern flank. Roughly 200,000 men, nearly 600 tanks and assault guns. Elite divisions like the 1st SS Panzer Division, commanded by the ruthless Joachim Pieper, a decorated and feared officer whose Kampfgruppe, KHMFRPU, or battle group, is tasked with leading the charge. Pieper is 30 years old, a fanatic, a veteran of the Eastern Front where he earned a reputation for speed, aggression, and a certain ruthlessness in dealing with obstacles. His Kampfgruppe is the spearhead of the spearhead, the fastest, most heavily armed unit in the entire offensive. If anyone can reach the Meuse, it's Pieper. The weather? Atrocious. Fog. Snow. Low clouds that ground the Allied air forces and give the Germans a free pass. The American defenders? A patchwork of green troops and exhausted divisions resting after months of grinding combat. Roughly 80,000 GIs stretched thin across the quiet Ardennes sector. Many of them are replacement troops, fresh from training camps in the States, who have never heard a shot fired in anger. Others are veteran units pulled off the line for rest and refit, exhausted, understrength, complacent. The Americans aren't expecting anything. Intelligence reports suggest the Germans are finished. Kaput. Done. The war will be over by Christmas. Everything is falling into place, except for one small problem. Germany is running on fumes. The fatal assumption. Let's talk fuel, or rather the lack of it. By late 1944, Germany's oil supply is in shambles. Allied strategic bombing has systematically crippled synthetic fuel plants across the Reich. Every week, waves of American B-17 Flying Fortresses and British Lancaster bombers pound refineries, cracking plants, and storage depots. Romania's Ploiești HT oil fields, once the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, producing millions of barrels annually, are now in Soviet hands. The Luftwaffe is grounded not because it lacks planes, but because it lacks gasoline to fly them. Hundreds of brand-new Messerschmitt fighters sit idle on runways, their tanks empty, their pilots waiting for fuel allocations that never arrive. For Operation Walk dem Rhein, German planners estimate they need 5 million gallons of fuel. They manage to stockpile it, barely. Depots across Western Germany are scraped clean. Every available tanker truck is requisitioned. Rail cars are diverted from other fronts. But getting that fuel to the front lines? That's another story. Allied air attacks destroy convoys. Railroad bridges are blown. Traffic jams clog the narrow roads leading to the assembly areas. Only half of the allocated fuel actually reaches the Panzer divisions before the offensive begins. Do the German High Command pause? Do they reconsider? No, because they have a backup plan. A plan so desperate, so absurdly optimistic, that it borders on delusion. They will capture Allied fuel depots along the way. Think about that for a moment. The success of Germany's last major offensive, the operation meant to turn the tide of the entire war, hinges on stealing gas from the enemy. It's like planning a cross-country road trip with a quarter tank and hoping you stumble upon a few unlocked gas stations. Except those gas stations are guarded, and the owners are actively trying to shoot you. The logic goes like this. American supply lines are so efficient, so abundant, that they've established massive fuel dumps throughout Belgium and France. These depots contain millions of gallons of gasoline, stored in thousands of jerry cans and in bulk tanks. If the Germans can capture just a few of these depots before the Americans destroy them, the offensive can continue. Speed is essential. Aggression is paramount. Hesitation is death. Hitler's generals know the math doesn't add up. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander, is skeptical. He's an old Prussian officer, a veteran of the First World War, a man who understands logistics. Model and Manschufel, seasoned panzer commanders who fought on the Eastern Front, voice concerns. They've seen what happens when supply lines stretch too thin. They've watched brilliant offensives collapse because the tanks ran dry. But Hitler is insistent. The Führer believes in willpower over logistics. He believes that speed, surprise, and audacity will compensate for empty fuel trucks. He dismisses objections as defeatism. He accuses his generals of lacking faith, of being too cautious, of forgetting that Germany won its greatest victories by taking risks. And so, on December 16th, 1944, the panzers roll forward. They have just enough fuel to get started, but not nearly enough to finish. The illusion of momentum. For the first 48 hours, it almost works. The initial artillery barrage catches the Americans completely off guard. Green troops from the 106th Infantry Division, many of them fresh off the boat from the States, still writing letters home about how quiet the Ardennes is, find themselves surrounded and overrun. Entire regiments surrender. Command posts dissolve into chaos. Radio operators scream for reinforcements that aren't coming. Officers try to organize defenses, but the situation is too fluid, too fast, too overwhelming. In the northern sector, Kampfgruppe paper punches through American lines like a fist through wet paper. Paper's column, a steel serpent of 140 vehicles stretching for 15 miles, roars westward. Panthers, tigers, half-tracks packed with SS grenadiers. They move fast, aggressive, ruthless. Villages are bypassed if they're defended, captured if they're not. Bridges are seized before American engineers can blow them. American supply convoys, caught on the roads, are shot up and plundered for anything useful. Paper's men are riding a wave of adrenaline and momentum. For the first time in months, they're advancing. The Americans are running. The war impossibly seems winnable again. Back at German headquarters, officers huddle over maps and trace Paper's progress with quiet satisfaction. The plan is unfolding. The Americans are reeling. Antwerp beckons. But beneath the surface, tiny fractures are already forming. Fractures that will soon become fissures. The first warning, roads that don't exist. Paper's orders are simple. Seize the bridges over the Meuse River and don't stop for anything. Speed is everything. Hesitation is death. There's just one problem. The roads. German intelligence has provided Paper staff with detailed maps of the Ardennes. These maps show a network of paved highways and secondary routes, perfect for rapid mechanized advance. What the maps don't show is that many of these roads are little more than dirt logging trails, barely wide enough for a farm truck, let alone a 70-ton King Tiger. The Ardennes is not tank country. It's steep, heavily forested, crossed by hundreds of streams and ravines. The roads twist and turn, climbing hillsides and descending into narrow valleys where a single disabled vehicle can block an entire column. On December 17th, Paper's column grind to a halt at Lanzerath, Landsiedrat. The route ahead, a narrow, winding forest track, is choked with mud and snow. Tanks slip off the road, their tracks spinning uselessly. Half-tracks bog down in the muck. Engineers scramble forward with shovels and tow cables, try and keep the column moving. Precious hours evaporate. Paper seethes. Every minute of delay is a minute the Americans can regroup, reinforce, counterattack. He radios his superiors, demanding better routes. The response is evasive. Stick to the plan. Maintain momentum. Capture the bridges. He pushes forward anyway, his jaw clenched, his patience fraying. The second warning, the weather turns. Hitler's gamble depends on one critical factor, bad weather. As long as the skies remain overcast, Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded J-bows, short for Jag bomber, stay grounded. Without air support, American ground forces are vulnerable. The Germans have learned this lesson the hard way over the past year. Whenever the sky is clear, Allied aircraft appear by the hundreds, strafing columns, destroying vehicles, turning roads into graveyards. For the first 3 days, the weather holds. Thick fog blankets the Ardennes. Snowstorms roll through. Visibility drops to a few dozen yards. The Allies are blind. Their tactical air forces sit idle on muddy airfields in France. Pilots drinking coffee and playing cards, waiting for the weather to break. But on December 23rd, the clouds part. It happens suddenly. Dawn breaks over the Ardennes, and instead of the usual gray overcast, there's a brilliant, merciless blue sky. The kind of sky that makes photographers reach for their cameras and soldiers reach for their helmets. Within hours, Allied pilots are scrambling. P-47s, Typhoons, Thunderbolts. They come in waves, squadrons of them, roaring low over the treetops. They strafe anything that moves. Fuel trucks explode in fireballs. Supply convoys scatter into the woods. Tanks, caught in the open, are pounded with rockets and cannon fire. The narrow Ardennes roads, once arteries of advance, become death traps littered with burning wreckage and twisted metal. German panzer crews learn a brutal new routine. Move at night, hide during the day, and pray. They camouflage their vehicles with tree branches. They park under overhanging cliffs. They huddle in cellars and barns, listening to the drone of aircraft overhead, waiting for the sun to set. But you can't capture a port city by hiding in the woods. The offensive, so explosive in its opening act, begins to slow. The third warning, the fuel gauges don't lie. By December 18th, Fuel is already becoming crisis. Paper's camp grub is supposed to receive regular resupply from the rear. Fuel trucks should be arriving every few hours, topping off tanks, keeping the column moving. But the supply trucks aren't arriving. Some are stuck in traffic jams that stretch for miles. Thousands of vehicles competing for the same few roads, tangled in massive snarls that take hours to untangle. Others are destroyed by American artillery or airstrikes before they even reach the front. A few simply get lost in the maze of forest roads, their drivers disoriented, their maps useless. Paper radios back to divisional headquarters. He needs fuel, urgently. His tanks are running on reserves. Without resupply, he'll be immobilized within 24 hours. The response is vague, reassuring. Supplies are on the way. Maintain your advance. Do not stop. They're not on the way. On his maps, Paper sees salvation. American fuel depots scattered across Belgium. Intelligence reports suggest a massive stockpile near Stavelot-Stavelot, enough gasoline to fuel his entire battle group for weeks. There's another depot at Spa, just a few miles beyond Stavelot, 2.5 million gallons. If he can just reach it before the Americans destroy it, the mission is still viable. The offensive can continue. So he pushes on, fuel gauges dropping, engines coughing, the prize tantalizingly close. But with every mile gained, the margin for error shrinks. The disconnect, generals versus reality. Back at Field Marshal von Rundstedt's headquarters, the mood is cautiously optimistic. Colored pins on wall maps show German spearheads advancing westward. Red arrows point toward the Meuse. Reports trickle in. Bridges captured, towns seized, American units scattered. From this distance, hundreds of miles from the front, everything looks manageable. The offensive is progressing. Casualties are acceptable. The Americans are falling back. What the maps don't show is the growing desperation on the ground. They don't show panzer crews siphoning fuel from disabled vehicles just to keep moving, draining every last drop from wrecked half-tracks and abandoned trucks. They don't show the traffic jams at bottleneck crossings, tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces all competing for the same narrow bridge, backed up for miles, engines idling, precious fuel burning away. They don't show the exhaustion creeping into faces of soldiers who have been awake for 72 hours straight, surviving on adrenaline and cold rations, fighting and driving and fighting again. Von Rundstedt knows the offensive is a gamble. He's not naive. But even he doesn't fully grasp how thin the margins have become. The reports he receives are filtered through layers of optimistic staff officers who emphasize successes and downplay problems. The numbers on paper look sufficient. The arrows on the map point in the right direction. Hitler, meanwhile, is ecstatic. He paces his headquarters in East Prussia, demanding updates every few hours, insisting that his generals maintain momentum. When officers suggest consolidating gains or redirecting forces to more achievable objectives, he dismisses them. Antwerp is the goal. Nothing less will do. The British must be cut off. The Americans must be shattered. The war in the West must be ended so Germany can face the Soviets with undivided attention. The Führer's maps show arrows driving toward the Meuse River. The reality is far messier. The final quiet warning. Stavelot, December 18th. Late afternoon. Paper's advance guard reaches the outskirts of Stavelot. The town sits on the Amblev River, Amblev, a natural obstacle that must be crossed. A stone bridge spans a river, old, narrow, but intact. More importantly, the town sits just 3 miles from the American fuel depot at Spa. 3 miles. Paper can taste victory. His tanks are running on fumes, but if he can secure that depot, everything changes. Millions of gallons of American gasoline, enough to refuel his entire camp grub and continue the drive to the Meuse, enough to turn a near disaster into a triumph. There's just one problem. The bridge at Stavelot is intact, but it's lightly defended by American engineers. Paper's lead elements, reconnaissance troops and armored cars, could seize it immediately. A quick rush, overwhelm the defenders, secure the crossing. But his main column is strung out for miles behind him, delayed by traffic and muddy roads. His Panthers and Tigers, the heavy punch he needs to exploit the breakthrough, are still catching up. He makes a decision, a fateful one. He pauses, regroups, waits for the rest of his camp group to catch up. He'll attack in force in the morning, with his full strength, and smash through whatever the Americans can throw at him. It's a logical move, the cautious move, the move that any competent commander would make when facing an unknown defensive position. It's also the move that dooms him, because while Paper waits, the Americans are not waiting. Engineers at the Spa Depot receive frantic warnings. German panzers are coming. They don't have time to destroy the fuel. There's too much, and the demolition would take hours. Instead, they prepare to evacuate, loading trucks with essential equipment, setting up fallback positions. American reinforcements, scraped together from nearby units, cooks and clerks and military police armed with bazookas, rush toward Stavelot to hold the bridge. By dawn on December 19th, the window has closed. When Paper resumes his advance, the bridge is contested. American anti-tank guns are dug in on the far side. Infantry with bazookas hide in the buildings overlooking the crossing. The fuel depot, those 2.5 million gallons, is just out of reach, so close he can see the route on his map, but impossibly far given his fuel situation. And Paper's tanks are running on vapors. The unraveling begins. Across the Ardennes front, similar stories are unfolding. Panzer column stall. Supply lines stretch to breaking point. Units that should be racing toward the Meuse are instead scavenging for fuel, sending soldiers on foot into American rear areas to search for abandoned vehicles, jerry cans, anything that burns. The 5th Panzer Army in the center makes better progress, but even they are slowing. General von Manchefeld's forces reach the outskirts of Bastogne, a critical road junction. If they can capture it, they'll control the main highways leading west. But Bastogne is defended. The American 101st Airborne Division has been rushed into the town, digging in, preparing for a siege. Every hour spent fighting for Bastogne is an hour not spent driving toward the Meuse. Every gallon of fuel burned in battle is a gallon that can't be used for the advance. The German offensive, so explosive in its opening act, is losing momentum, not because of superior Allied strategy, not because of heroic last stands, though there are plenty of those, but because the panzers are literally running out of gas. The maps back at headquarters still show arrows pointing west, but out in the frozen forest, reality is setting in. The race against empty. December 19th. Dawn. Joachim Paper stands in the turret of his command Panther. Binoculars press his eyes, scanning the hills west of Stillmont. His breath comes in clouds of vapor. The cold bites at his face. Smoke rises from a burning American half-track. Somewhere ahead, a thin black column against the gray sky. The air smells of cordite and diesel exhaust and something else. Something acrid and chemical that makes his eyes water. Behind him, strung out along a narrow forest road like beads on a string, sit the remnants of his once mighty camp group. Panthers with their long 75mm guns, capable of punching through any Allied tank at range. Tigers bristling with armor, nearly invulnerable from the front. King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world. Each one a masterpiece of German engineering. Half-tracks filled with exhausted grenadiers who haven't slept in days, their faces hollow, their eyes distant. They are 15 miles from the Meuse River, 15 miles from breaking through to open country, 15 miles from turning Hitler's desperate gamble into a miracle. But Paper's fuel gauges tell a different story. Most of his tanks are running on reserves, the needle hovering near empty. Some have already sputtered to a halt and been pushed to the roadside, their crews joining other units on foot. His supply trucks, the ones that were supposed to keep him moving, never arrived. Destroyed by airstrikes, lost in traffic jams, trapped behind blown bridges, captured by American patrols. He radios his officers. The message is blunt. We advance or we die here. There is no third option. His battalion commanders acknowledge. They understand. They've been fighting long enough to know what happens to units that get cut off and surrounded. They've seen it on the Eastern Front. They know how it ends. Paper lowers his binoculars, climbs down into the turret, orders the driver forward. The Panther's engine roars to life. The column begins to move. 3 miles from Salvation, the American Fuel Depot at Spa sits just beyond the next ridgeline, nestled in a valley surrounded by pine forests. 2.5 million gallons. Thousands of jerrycans stacked in pyramids. Bulk storage tanks filled to capacity. Fuel trucks parked in neat rows, ready to supply the Allied advance into Germany. Enough gasoline to fuel Paper's entire battle group for weeks. Enough to reach the Meuse, cross it, and drive all the way to Antwerp if necessary. Paper knows it's there. His intelligence maps mark it clearly. American prisoners, interrogated the day before, confirmed its location. One of them, a logistics sergeant who'd been stationed at the depot, even drew a sketch showing the layout, the access roads, the defensive positions. 3 miles, the distance of a morning jog, a bicycle ride, a leisurely walk through the woods. But between Paper and that depot stands the town of Stillmont, and the Americans are dug in. At 0600 hours, Paper launches his assault. He sends infantry from the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment forward under cover darkness, infiltrating American positions, moving silently through the snow. Behind them, his Panthers rumble into the town's eastern edge, their engines growling, their tracks chewing through cobblestones, crushing obstacles. The Americans fight back. Bazookas flash from windows, their rockets streaking across the narrow streets. Machine guns stutter from behind overturned trucks and makeshift barricades. An American tank battalion arrives, Shermans, outgunned but determined, their crews brave enough to face the Panthers at point-blank range. For 2 hours, the battle rages. House to house, street to street. Paper's panzers grind forward, crushing resistance, blasting through barricades. Grenadiers clear buildings with grenades and submachine guns. The Americans fall back, contesting every block, making the Germans pay for every yard. By 10:30, Stillmont falls. Paper has won, but winning has cost him. Ammunition expended, fuel burned, casualties mounting. 3 Panthers knocked out, 2 Tigers damaged, dozens of Grenadiers fallen. And now, standing in the center of the captured town, surrounded by burning buildings and the moans of wounded men, he faces a calculation that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The moment of reckoning. Paper gathers his staff officers around a hastily unfolded map spread across the hood of a half-track. His operations officer, his fuel officer, his intelligence officer. They're all exhausted, faces smudged with soot, uniforms torn. The bridge west of Stillmont is intact. American engineers didn't have time to blow it before retreating. Beyond it, the road to Spa is open, winding, narrow but passable. The fuel depot is practically undefended. Most of the American rear echelon troops have evacuated. It's there for the taking. One of his lieutenants urges him forward. We can reach it in an hour, Herr Standartenführer. Maybe less. The Americans are running. We have them. Paper stares at the map. His finger traces a route. 3 miles. Then he does something no commander wants to do. He checks the fuel manifests. His fuel officer, a meticulous captain who's been tracking consumption since the offensive began, hands him a clipboard covered in handwritten notes. The numbers are brutal. His remaining tanks have enough gas to cross the bridge and advance another few kilometers. Maybe, if they don't encounter resistance, if they don't have to maneuver, if everything goes perfectly, but not enough to come back if things go wrong. Not enough to maneuver if they encounter a defensive line. Not enough to retreat if the Americans counterattack. His intelligence officer points to the map. Herr Standartenführer, American forces have recaptured Stavelot. Our supply line is cut. Kampfgruppe Hansen was supposed to relieve us, but they're bogged down at Poteau. Schnellgruppeniddel is engaged near Troppans. We're isolated. Paper knows. He's been receiving fragmentary reports all morning. The offensive, so promising just 48 hours ago, is collapsing into chaos. Units are scattered. Communications are breaking down. The grand plan to reach the Meuse is disintegrating into a dozen separate battles, each one draining precious resources. If he pushes forward and fails to capture the depot, if the Americans have already evacuated it or destroyed it or reinforced it, his entire Kampfgruppe will be stranded with empty tanks, surrounded by an increasingly angry enemy. Paper makes his decision. We consolidate here. Defensive positions. Wait for resupply and reinforcements. His officers stare at him. One starts to protest, but Paper cuts him off. Those are my orders. It is a rational choice. The cautious choice. The choice that keeps his men alive a little longer. The choice that any competent commander would make when facing uncertain odds and dwindling resources. It is also the choice that seals his fate, because the reinforcements are not coming, and neither is the fuel. Headquarters, the collapse of the dream. 600 miles to the east, in a bunker beneath the frozen ground of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler receives the latest situation reports. The war room is cramped, overheated, thick with cigarette smoke. Staff officers in pristine uniforms trace the front lines on oversized maps mounted on the walls. Colored pins mark German positions. Red arrows show the direction of advance. Blue pins mark known American positions. From this distance, hundreds of miles from the mud and blood and chaos, the offensive still looks promising. Paper has reached Stillmont. The 5th Panzer Army has surrounded Bastogne. The 6th SS Panzer Army is pushing toward Elsenborn Ridge. American units are retreating. Confusion reigns. Hitler, pale and trembling from the aftereffects of the July assassination attempt, leans over the map. His left hand shakes uncontrollably, the result of Parkinson's disease, though no one dares mention it. His voice, when he speaks, is hoarse but insistent. When will Paper reach the Meuse? His chief of staff, a cautious general who's learned to phrase bad news carefully, hesitates. Mein Führer, there are logistical challenges. Fuel supplies. Fuel. Hitler interrupts. Always fuel. The Americans have fuel depots everywhere. Paper will capture them. Speed is essential. Momentum must be maintained. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, standing in the back of the room, says nothing. He's learned that arguing with Hitler is futile. The Führer will believe what he wants to believe. The maps show what he wants to see. But von Rundstedt knows the truth. He's received reports from divisional commanders, reports that don't make it to Hitler's briefings, reports about empty fuel trucks, stalled columns, traffic jams, air attacks. The offensive, so explosive in its opening, is grinding to a halt, not because the Americans are fighting brilliantly, not because Allied strategy is superior, but because the panzers have run out of gas. Hitler demands another briefing in 6 hours. He wants updates on Paper's progress. He wants to know when Antwerp will fall. He waves dismissively at his staff and retreats to his private quarters. The officers exchange glances. No one speaks. The Führer's maps show what he wants to see. Reality, as always, refuses to cooperate. The final hours. December 22nd. Paper's camp group is now trapped in the village of La Glise, a tiny cluster of stone houses perched on a hilltop overlooking a valley. It's a strong defensive position. Steep approaches, good fields of fire, but it's also a trap. The only road out leads back toward German lines, and that road is now controlled by American forces. American artillery pounds them relentlessly. Shells scream in every few minutes. 105mm rounds that obliterate buildings, crater roads, send shrapnel whining through the air. The bombardment never stops. Day and night. Methodical. Devastating. Fighter-bombers circle overhead like vultures, waiting for any vehicle foolish enough to move, any target worth a rocket. Paper's men are out of food. They're eating snow mixed with sugar scavenged from a destroyed supply truck. They're out of medical supplies. Wounded men lie in cellars, tended by an exhausted medic with nothing but bandages and morphine. They're out of ammunition for everything except small arms. The Panzers still have shells for their main guns, but nothing else. And, most critically, they're out of fuel. His Panthers and Tigers sit motionless in the village square and along the approach roads, their turrets still swiveling to track targets, their guns still firing when American infantry probe the perimeter. But they cannot move. There are 67 stationary pillboxes, each one worth hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks, each one representing months of factory labor and scarce resources, each one now utterly useless. A desperate Luftwaffe resupply mission attempts to parachute fuel and supplies to Paper's position. Junkers Ju-52s, lumbering transport planes, brave Allied air defenses to drop canisters over Log-Lees. But SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke, coordinating the drop from headquarters, insists that Paper's grid coordinates are wrong. The supplies land in American hands in Stillmont instead, a few miles away. Paper watches the parachutes drift down behind enemy lines. White canopies against the gray sky. He doesn't bother to radio headquarters again. There's no point. Abandonment. December 24th. Christmas Eve. Paper gathers his remaining officers in the cellar of a half-destroyed farmhouse. 800 men, all that's left of a battle group that once numbered over 4,000. Veterans, survivors, men who followed him from the Russian steppes to the Belgian forests. The cellar is lit by a single kerosene lamp. Shadows dance on the stone walls. The men's faces are gaunt, hollow-eyed, exhausted beyond measure. "We are leaving," Paper tells them. "On foot. Tonight, we break out through the American lines and march back to our own positions." There are no protests. Everyone understands. They've been soldiers long enough to know when a position is untenable. The tanks will be destroyed. Demolition charges on the engines. The half-tracks will be blown up. The wounded who cannot walk will be left behind with American prisoners and a medic. They'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. One of his captains speaks up. "And our objective, Herr Standartenführer?" Paper looks at him. "Survival." That night, under cover darkness, 800 men slip out of Log-Lees and begin the long trek back to German lines. They move silently through the snow, past the hulks of their own destroyed vehicles, past the frozen bodies of comrades who fell days earlier, past burning buildings and shattered equipment. Behind them, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and countless trucks sit abandoned in the snow. Engineers place demolition charges on engines, just enough to render them useless without creating massive explosions that would alert the Americans. The next morning, American forces enter Log-Lees cautiously, expecting a fight. Instead, they find a ghost town. Empty buildings, abandoned vehicles, a few wounded Germans too injured to walk. The fuel gauges on every tank read the same. Empty, the tragic mathematics. 3 miles. That is how close Paper came to the Spa fuel depot. 2.5 million gallons of gasoline, sitting undefended for hours, waiting to be captured. Enough fuel to change the course of the entire offensive. Enough fuel to reach the Meuse, cross it, and threaten Antwerp. Enough fuel to validate Hitler's gamble and extend the war by months. 3 miles. The distance of a morning jog, a bicycle ride, a leisurely walk. But for a Panzer division running on fumes, it might as well have been 3,000 miles. Across the entire Ardennes front, the story repeats itself with maddening consistency. The 5th Panzer Army reaches Dinant, just 4 miles from the Meuse River, the objective that would split the Allied armies, before grinding to a halt. Not because British tanks stopped them, not because American artillery destroys them, but because they have no fuel left to advance. Units that should be racing toward Antwerp are instead sitting motionless on roads, their commanders radioing desperately for resupply that never arrives. Hitler's grand offensive, the operation meant to split the Allies, recapture Antwerp, and turn the tide of the war, collapses not in a climactic battle with massed armies clashing in dramatic confrontation, but in a slow, grinding stall. The panzers do not explode in glorious combat. They simply stop moving and sit there, silent, empty, defeated by arithmetic. The silence after the storm. January 25th, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge officially ends. Not with a climactic confrontation, not with decisive charge or a dramatic surrender or a signing ceremony. It simply stops. The guns fall silent. The front stabilizes. Soldiers on both sides collapse into exhausted sleep. The Germans retreat eastward, back across the frozen Belgian countryside they had seized just weeks earlier. They leave behind burning villages, cratered roads, destroyed bridges, and tens of thousands of fallen soldiers from both sides. The bulge in the Allied lines, that threatening salient that had once pointed like a dagger toward Antwerp, gradually flattens as American and British forces reclaim lost ground, village by village, hill by hill. By the time it's over, the front lines have returned almost exactly to where they were on December 15th, as if nothing had happened. Except, of course, everything has happened. The snow covering the Ardennes hides thousands of graves. American, German, British, civilians. The forests are littered with destroyed equipment. The roads are scarred with shell craters. The villages are ruins. And somewhere in the snow near La Gleize, 67 German tanks sit abandoned, monuments to one of the greatest logistical failures in military history. The toll, the numbers, when they're finally compiled weeks later, are staggering. American casualties, approximately 81,000 men, 8,407 killed, 46,170 wounded, 20,905 missing or captured. It is the largest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II, the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces since Bataan in the Philippines 3 years earlier. But the Americans can replace their losses. Replacement troops are already en route from the States. New equipment is rolling off assembly lines in Detroit and Pittsburgh. Within weeks, the U.S. Army will be stronger than it was before the offensive began. German casualties, roughly 100,000. But unlike the Americans, the Germans cannot replace them. Every veteran Panzer Grenadier lost is irreplaceable. Every destroyed tank represents industrial capacity that no longer exists. Germany's factories are being pounded by Allied bombers day and night. The synthetic fuel plants are ruins. The rail network is paralyzed. The replacement troops arriving at the front are 16-year-old boys and 50-year-old men, hastily trained, poorly equipped, terrified. More than 600 German armored vehicles lie scattered across the Ardennes. Tigers, Panthers, King Tigers, some destroyed in combat, their turrets blown off by ammunition explosions, their hulls burned out, many simply abandoned when their fuel tanks ran dry, left by the roadside or hidden in forests, their crews walking back to German lines or surrendering to American patrols. The Luftwaffe, making a desperate final appearance on New Year's Day in Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise attack on Allied airfields, loses hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. The operation destroys some Allied planes on the ground, but the losses are catastrophic for the Germans. The Allies replace their losses within weeks. The Germans never recover. For the rest of the war, the Luftwaffe will be a ghost, appearing occasionally but never in force. Hitler's gamble has consumed Germany's last strategic reserves. The men, the tanks, the ammunition, the fuel, all thrown into one final, desperate offensive. For nothing. How the world learned. When news of the offensive first breaks, Allied newspapers scramble to make sense of it. Germans launch major attack in Belgium. The headlines scream in the New York Times, the London Telegraph, the Paris edition of Stars and Stripes. There is shock, confusion, fear. After months of steady Allied advances, Paris liberated, the Siegfried Line breached, the Rhine within sight. The idea that the Wehrmacht could still mount a major offensive seems impossible. Reporters at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force press briefings fire questions at press officers. How big is the attack? How many German divisions? Are we losing? Is the invasion collapsing? Censors clamp down on details. General Eisenhower's headquarters releases carefully worded communiques that downplay the severity of the situation. The goal is twofold: prevent panic on the home front, and keep the Germans guessing about Allied intentions and capabilities. Maps showing the extent of the German penetration are classified. Casualty figures are withheld. Reporters are forbidden from mentioning specific unit locations. But soldiers' letters home, those that make it past the censors, tell a different story. So do the casualty lists that begin arriving in American towns and British villages in late December and early January. Gold stars appear in windows. Telegrams are delivered by somber Western Union messengers. By late December, when General George S. Patton's Third Army executes a brilliant 90-degree turn and breaks through to relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, the narrative begins to shift. Now the press focuses on American resilience. General Anthony McCullough's famous one-word response to a German surrender demand, "Nuts!" becomes a rallying cry, reprinted in newspapers across America. The defenders of Bastogne are lionized as heroes who refuse to break, soldiers who held against overwhelming odds. The full scope of the disaster, particularly the fuel crisis that crippled the German advance, only emerges later, as intelligence officers interrogate prisoners and analyze captured documents in the months after the war ends. What they discover is almost incomprehensible. Germany launched its most ambitious offensive of the war, an operation involving 3 armies, 200,000 men, 600 tanks, knowing it lacked the fuel to sustain it. The entire operation depended on capturing Allied supply depots. Depots the Allies could easily destroy or defend. Depots that, in many cases, were evacuated hours before German forces arrived. It was not a plan. It was a prayer wrapped in delusion and desperation. The cost of ego. In the bunker beneath Berlin, where Hitler has relocated as the Soviets close in, the Führer refuses to accept reality. When reports arrive in late December and early January detailing the offensive's collapse, he blames his generals. They lack will. They hesitated at critical moments. They failed to execute his vision with sufficient aggression and determination. If only Dietrich had been more aggressive. If only paper had pushed harder. If only the weather had held for another week. The possibility that his vision was flawed from the start, that no amount of willpower can compensate for empty fuel tanks, that logistics matter more than determination, never seems to occur to him. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had voiced skepticism from the beginning, is quietly sidelined. Other officers who dared question the operation's feasibility face similar fates. Some are relieved of command. Others are sent to the Eastern Front, which by this point is a death sentence. A few simply disappear, arrested by the Gestapo on vague charges of defeatism. Hitler's insistence on maintaining unrealistic objectives, his refusal to authorize tactical withdrawals once the advance stalled, his orders to hold untenable positions, turn a risky gamble into a full-blown catastrophe. Resources that might have been conserved were instead squandered in futile attacks. Troops that could have reinforced Germany's eastern defenses against the looming Soviet winter offensive were wasted in Belgium, fighting for villages and road junctions that had no strategic value. By February, the Red Army will launch its final massive offensive. Soviet forces will smash through German lines and advance 200 miles in 3 weeks. There will be no reserves left to stop them, no panzer divisions to launch counterattacks, no fuel to maneuver, nothing, because those reserves died in the Ardennes, chasing a fuel depot they could never reach, fighting for objectives that existed only on Hitler's maps, lessons learned and ignored. Military historians would spend decades dissecting the Battle of the Bulge, writing hundreds of books and articles, analyzing every decision, every battle, every what-if scenario. For the Americans, the lessons are painful but clear. Complacency is deadly. Intelligence failures allowed the Germans to achieve total surprise. Defensive positions in the Ardennes were undermanned and poorly coordinated. Communication systems broke down under the initial assault. Green troops panicked and surrendered. But when the crisis hit, American forces adapted. Commanders like Eisenhower and Patton responded with speed and flexibility. Eisenhower committed his strategic reserves without hesitation, rushing the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to critical positions. Patton executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, pivoting his entire Third Army 90 degrees and attacking north in the middle of winter. Soldiers like those at Bastogne held the line despite being surrounded and outnumbered, transforming what could have been a rout into a fighting withdrawal. The American military emerged from the Battle of the Bulge bloodied but stronger, having learned hard lessons about intelligence, defensive preparation, and the importance of maintaining reserves. For the Germans, the lessons should have been obvious, but were never absorbed. Logistics matter. Fuel matters. Ammunition matters. Supply lines matter. You cannot win a mechanized war by hoping to steal supplies from the enemy. You cannot compensate for material shortages with willpower and determination, no matter how fierce. Willpower does not move tanks. Determination does not generate gasoline. Courage does not refill ammunition depots. And yet, even as the Third Reich crumbles, even as Soviet armies close in from the east and Allied armies mass on the Rhine, Hitler continues to order offensives that exist only on paper. Perfido will continue finalizer o Rotero, completando as secos restantes para atingir as 6.000 palavras. Continua KO de Part 4. Armies that have been destroyed weeks earlier are ordered to counterattack. Divisions that exist only in name. Phantom units on organizational charts, with no men, no equipment, no supplies, are assigned impossible missions. Hold at all costs, the orders read. Counterattack immediately. Advance to your objective. The maps in the bunkers show what the Führer wants to see. Reality, bloodied and exhausted, limps eastward toward Berlin. By April, Soviet artillery will be shelling the Reich Chancellery. Hitler will retreat to his underground bunker, surrounded by maps showing armies that no longer exist, giving orders to units that have long since ceased to function. In his final days, he will still be blaming his generals for lacking the will to win. He will never admit that willpower cannot substitute for fuel. The ghosts of La Gleize. Today, if you visit the village of La Gleize in Belgium, you'll find something extraordinary in the town square. A Tiger II tank. King Tiger. The most powerful tank of World War II. It sits there massive and imposing, its long gun pointed toward the Western Road. The road to Spa. The road to the fuel depot that was never captured. Children climb on it during summer vacations. Tourists photograph it. Tour guides explain its specifications. Armor thickness up to 7 inches, capable of stopping any Allied shell. An 88mm gun that could destroy any tank in existence. A Maybach engine producing 700 horsepower. Weight, 69 tons. It's one of Joachim Paper's abandoned vehicles. Serial number 501. Too heavy to move. Left behind when his Kampfgruppe fled on foot on Christmas Eve, 1944. The locals preserved it as a memorial, a reminder, a testament to the battle that raged through their village. The tank is remarkably well preserved. You can still see the German markings, the battle damage from American weapons, the camouflage paint, faded but visible. The interior has been sealed, but through the viewing ports you can glimpse the cramped crew compartment where 5 men worked, fought, and eventually abandoned their post. What the tour guides often don't emphasize, what many visitors don't fully grasp, is why this technological marvel, this pinnacle of German military engineering, sits in a Belgian town square instead of being driven back to Germany for repair and reuse. Not because it was destroyed in heroic combat, knocked out by superior American firepower or brave tank destroyers. Not because American artillery scored a lucky hit on its vulnerable rear armor. Not because Allied air power reduced it to a burning wreck, but because it ran out of gas. 3 miles from salvation. 3 miles from 2.5 million gallons of fuel. 3 miles from changing the course of history. 3 miles that might as well have been 3 million. The Tiger II in La Gleize is not alone. Across the Ardennes, in fields and forests, collectors and museums have preserved other remnants of Kampfgruppe paper. A Panther tank in a private collection near Stillmont. A half-track in a Belgian military museum. Photographs and archives showing dozens more, abandoned by the roadside, their crews long gone. Each one tells the same story. Each one ran out of gas. The question that haunts, how could this happen? It's the question that military historians have been asking for 80 years. How could one of the most meticulously planned military operations in history, an offensive involving 3 armies, hundreds of thousands of men, and Germany's finest remaining armor, fail because of something as mundane as preventable as running out of fuel? The planning for Operation Walk dem Rhein took months. Staff officers calculated supply requirements down to the last ton. Intelligence officers mapped American positions. Engineers identified bridge capacities and road conditions. Meteorologists predicted weather patterns. Every detail was considered. Every contingency planned for, except the most important one. The answer, uncomfortable as it is, comes down to hubris. Hitler and his inner circle believed that determination alone could overcome material realities. They believed that speed and surprise would compensate for inadequate logistics. They believed that German soldiers, superior in training, equipment, and fighting spirit, could accomplish what the numbers said was impossible. They believed that willpower could substitute for gasoline. This wasn't stupidity. These weren't incompetent commanders making amateur mistakes. Hitler's general staff included some of the most experienced military minds in the world, men who had orchestrated the conquest of Poland in weeks, France in months, men who had commanded armies across the steppes of Russia, who understood logistics and supply chains. But they had become victims of their own propaganda. Years of victories had bred a dangerous overconfidence. The spectacular successes of 1939 and 1940, achieved when Germany had adequate resources and the advantage of surprise, had created an illusion that boldness could always triumph over material limitations. They forgot, or chose to ignore, that those early victories were won when German fuel depots were full, when supply lines were short, when the industrial base was intact and productive. By late 1944, none of those conditions existed. Yet they launched the offensive anyway. They gambled everything on capturing enemy fuel depots. They planned a massive mechanized offensive in difficult terrain with inadequate fuel supplies. They set ambitious objectives, Antwerp, the Meuse, the splitting of Allied armies, without ensuring they had the means to achieve them. It would be easy to dismiss this as simple arrogance, but it was more than that. It was a fundamental failure to accept reality, a refusal to acknowledge that modern mechanized warfare is, at its core, a logistical exercise, that tanks don't run on courage. That determination cannot replace diesel fuel. The Germans had the tanks. They had well-trained crews. They had tactical advantages of surprise and weather. They had motivated soldiers and experienced commanders. What they didn't have was gas. And in modern warfare, that's the only thing that ultimately mattered. The legacy of empty gauges. The Battle of the Bulge endures in popular memory as a story of American courage and resilience. And it is that, the defenders of Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, refusing to surrender. The engineers who held critical bridges against overwhelming odds. The tank crews and infantrymen who fought in brutal cold against a desperate enemy. The medics who treated wounded under artillery fire. The truck drivers who kept supplies moving through blizzards. These stories deserve to be told and remembered. But the Battle of the Bulge is also a cautionary tale about the limits of ambition and the dangers of self-delusion. It's a story about what happens when grand strategic visions collide with mundane logistical realities. When leaders confuse what they wish were true with what actually is true. When maps and plans and orders fail to account for the simple physics of mechanized warfare. It's a reminder that in military operations, in any complex undertaking, logistics matter more than vision, that fuel matters more than courage, that supply lines matter more than strategy. The abandoned tanks scattered across the Ardennes are monuments to this truth. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, hundreds of trucks and artillery pieces, billions of Reichsmarks worth of German engineering and industrial output, thousands of hours of skilled factory labor, scarce resources that Germany could not afford to waste, all abandoned in the snow, not destroyed in glorious combat, not sacrificed in heroic last stands, simply abandoned because the gauges read empty. This is the ultimate irony of the Battle of the Bulge. Germany's most ambitious offensive of 1944, the operation meant to turn the tide of the war, failed not because Allied soldiers fought better, not because American generals outmaneuvered their German counterparts, but because of basic arithmetic. The Germans needed X gallons of fuel to reach their objectives. They had Y gallons available. Y was less than X. Everything else, the tactical brilliance, the fighting spirit, the advanced technology, was irrelevant. No amount of determination can make a tank move without fuel. No forcible can generate gasoline from thin air. No brilliance of tactics can compensate for empty fuel tanks. It's a lesson written in frozen steel across the hills of Belgium. A lesson that modern militaries still study in war colleges around the world. A lesson about hubris and reality, about ambition and limitations, about the fatal danger of believing your own propaganda. Echoes in modern warfare. The lessons of the Battle of the Bulge extend far beyond World War II. Military historians point to it as a classic example of how not to plan an offensive, how overconfidence and wishful thinking can doom even the most meticulously planned operations, how logistics, the unglamorous work of supply and transport, determines the outcome of battles more than tactical brilliance or fighting spirit. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israeli armored forces experienced similar fuel shortages during their rapid advance into Egypt. Tanks outran their supply lines. Units had to halt their advance to await fuel trucks. The parallels to the Ardennes were striking, though the outcome was different. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, American military planners obsessed over fuel supplies. Massive fuel convoys were organized. Supply depots were positioned at calculated intervals. Mobile refueling stations followed advancing armored units. The lessons of the Ardennes have been absorbed. No matter how advanced your technology, how well-trained your troops, or how superior your tactics, it all means nothing if your tanks run out of gas. Modern military logistics is a science that would have been unrecognizable to the generals of World War II. Computers track every gallon of fuel, every case of ammunition, every meal ration. Satellite communications allow real-time coordination of supply convoys. GPS ensures that fuel trucks reach their destinations. The margin for error has narrowed considerably, but the fundamental truth remains: mechanized armies run on fuel. Always have. Always will. The Tiger II sitting in La Glease Town Square is a permanent reminder of what happens when that truth is ignored. The final accounting. In the end, Operation Walk dem Rhein accomplished nothing. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The British and American armies were not split. The Western Allies did not seek a negotiated peace. The Eastern Front received no reinforcements. Quite the opposite, as the divisions destroyed in the Ardennes were desperately needed to face the Soviet winter offensive. The offensive delayed the Allied advance into Germany by perhaps 6 weeks. It bought time, but time for what? Germany had no miracle weapons ready for deployment, no secret reserves, no diplomatic solutions. The delay simply prolonged the inevitable. The cost was catastrophic. 100,000 German casualties, 600 armored vehicles, irreplaceable fuel stocks, aircraft that couldn't be replaced, veterans who couldn't be retrained, industrial capacity that no longer existed, all for nothing. All because someone forgot to put gas in the tanks. Or rather, because someone convinced themselves that gas wasn't necessary, that willpower and determination and fighting spirit could compensate, that boldness could overcome mathematics. It couldn't. It never could. Paper survived the war. He was tried for war crimes. His Kampfgruppe had been involved in the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy during the offensive. He served time in prison, was eventually released, and lived quietly in France until 1976, when he was assassinated under mysterious circumstances. In interviews before his death, he rarely discussed the Battle of the Bulge in detail. When pressed about why his Kampfgruppe failed to reach the Meuse, his answers were terse. Fuel. We had no fuel. 3 words that summarize one of history's greatest military blunders. 3 words that explain how Germany's last great offensive collapsed. 3 words that should have been obvious before the first tank rolled forward on December 16th, 1944. We had no fuel. Conclusion: the lesson that never ages. War is often romanticized. We focus on the heroism, the tactical brilliance, the dramatic moments, the last-ditch defenses, the daring raids, the charismatic generals. But the Battle of the Bulge reminds us that war is ultimately about logistics, about supply chains and fuel trucks and ammunition depots, about ensuring that your soldiers have food, your tanks have gas, and your guns have shells. The unglamorous stuff, the boring stuff that doesn't make for exciting movies or dramatic books, but the stuff that actually wins wars. Hitler's grand vision, splitting the Allies, recapturing Antwerp, turning the tide of the war, failed because he ignored this truth, because he believed that determination could substitute for diesel fuel, because he convinced himself that boldness could overcome basic arithmetic. The result? 67 abandoned tanks sitting in the Belgian snow, 100,000 German casualties, the loss of Germany's last strategic reserves, the hastening of the Third Reich's final collapse, all because someone forgot to put gas in the tanks. It's a lesson written in steel and blood across the Ardennes. A lesson about hubris and reality. A lesson about ambition and limitations. A lesson that should never be forgotten. If this story left you shaking your head in disbelief, if you found yourself thinking, how is this even possible? Then you're starting to understand why military history matters. These aren't just dusty stories in the past, tales of long-dead generals and forgotten battles. They're reminders of how hubris, miscalculation, and a refusal to face reality can turn brilliant plans into catastrophic failures. They're lessons about human nature, about how even intelligent, experienced people can convince themselves that what they wish were true actually is true, about how desperation can lead to decisions that seem logical in the moment but are revealed as delusional in hindsight. And they're warnings that apply not just to military operations, but to any complex undertaking. That planning matters, that logistics matter, that you cannot substitute wishful thinking for careful preparation. So if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating disasters, or if you're sitting there thinking, they can't possibly have been that foolish, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're going to keep exploring the moments when brilliant strategies collapsed under the weight of their own absurdity, when military genius met logistical reality and lost, when the best laid plans foundered on the simplest obstacles. Thanks for watching. And remember, logistics matter. Always. No matter how good your plan is, no matter how motivated your troops are, no matter how advanced your technology is, if your tanks run out of gas 3 miles from the objective, none of it matters. Germany learned that lesson the hard way in the frozen forests of Belgium in December 1944. Let's make sure we never forget it.